Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us for the latest in our series of webcasts. Today, we're talking about the keys to successful enterprise risk management. So this is based on our experiences and those of our clients and some of the observations we've all had. So hopefully you'll find this useful. Obviously, we've got some presenters, and that isn't one of them. It's Halloween, so I thought I'd just wake you up a bit with a Halloween picture. I think that's a guy from Nightmare on Elm Street. But your real presenters are these two folks. I'm Dan French. I'm founder and CEO at Consider Solutions. And I know some of you, many of you have been on previous sessions we've run, and many of you are clients of ours. I'm very pleased to be joined by one of our expert managing consultants, Gil Hebert, who's we're both opposite sides of the Atlantic today. So welcome, Gil.
Thanks, Dan. Hey, everyone.
So we're going to be taking you through this discussion. I want to talk to you a little bit about the changing nature of risk, and we can't really talk about any aspect of business without thinking about the nature of change and transformation happening through digital, because it is affecting all aspects of how we think about business. I want to talk about the risk response cycle and what we call risk-informed decision making, the role of technology and the need for a single source of truth. I want to talk about the end-to-end process and the idea of a journey as well as a destination, and how do we manage change and drive adoption. And we're going to talk to you about a 9-stage framework for situation and strategy assessment. I'm going to have some summary and conclusions that come up. So this is going to be a 45-minute webcast, so we'll try and make best use of your time. Do please ask questions as you go through. So there is a panel on your GoToWebinar interface that allows you to ask questions. As ideas or questions pop up, just enter them there and we'll deal with them at the end. And that's the best way of making this work. If you have any technical issues, again, use the same response or the same interface, and we'll get one of our folks will get back to you and help you with any challenges you have there. So we're going to run a Q&A at the end, so please ask questions as we go through. So very briefly, in terms of the context from our perspective, we look at a lot of problems and business issues from this perspective of how do we get to world-class performance. And world-class performance is about driving the best business results. It's about reducing cost of operations. It's about optimizing cash flow. It's having better risk management, which clearly is the topic of today. On the right-hand side, we see the pillars which we execute that through. And on the right-hand side, we see process optimization, process transformation across the business. On the left-hand side, we see financial controls and compliance, which is an element of enterprise risk management, which is very much the central pillar there on the right-hand side. And you'll hear some ideas from us, and some of them you might think quite interesting. Some of them might even be innovative, but they're not all our ideas. Some of them come from our engagements with the folks who work with around the world, and these are some of them. So we thank them for their insights and being the catalyst for some of our work. So first of all, we've got 4 polls as we go through. This just keeps you active, but also it helps you get some context of who you're amongst. These are anonymous polls, so don't worry. In fact, this is just about what role you sit in, but they're anonymous just so we all get a sense of the context we're dealing with. So just enter into the poll here whether you believe your role is primarily about enterprise risk management or risk management in general. Number 2, it's about policy management. 3, about controls and compliance. 4, another business function. 5, a consultant or advisor. That should just take you 10 seconds. If it takes you longer than 10 seconds, probably best just answer 5. Let's have a look how you're doing. So what do we've got? So we've got, okay, quite a lot of other business functions and quite a lot of controls and compliance people. Okay, that's fine. And that also helps us frame the discussion. So appreciate that. Okay, we can't really start a discussion about any kind of business endeavor without this whole, working out what the impact of digital is. And I've got a couple of key points I want to make here, not a general dissertation about digital transformation, but all of our leaderships and executives are being asked to go and or encouraged to go and talk to digital leaders in Silicon Valley and other places around the world to learn how business should be. And there's some companies over here, some of whom you'll know, some of whom you may not, and some are very obviously sort of digital natives, and some you might not think are, but they've all got a very important story to tell in this discussion. I'm just going to pick on a couple because I'm just trying to make an introductory point here. So you look at Netflix, and obviously we all know Netflix, streaming video streaming, movie streaming. And the interesting thing about Netflix is I'm a Netflix customer, and I think they take money out of my bank account every month. I don't even know how much it is, but they don't communicate with me at all. But they are very intimate terms with the 5 consumers in my house, so they know exactly what the 10-year-old boy wants to watch, and they know how to serve up things he's likely to want to watch. They know exactly what the 16-year-old girl wants to watch, and they serve her exactly what she needs. And they know exactly what the 18-year-old boy would like to watch, if indeed they serve it through Netflix. But the point about this is most of us were brought up with this idea that the customer is king, the economic customer is king. And the world's changing somewhat, that it's the consumer is king or queen now. And the economic customer, whilst important, it's a focus on consumer is something we don't want to ever forget. And on the other side of the chart here, you see Uber and Airbnb on the right, and these two, they're kind of basically similar sort of gig economy businesses. They're basically dating agencies. They have no assets. They generate tremendous revenues and cash flow. But their focus really is all about intimacy and convenience. And we'll understand how those businesses work, whether it's ride hailing or whether it's accommodation. That intimacy and convenience is just making it easier and more convenient and better than the alternative. So these kind of 2 points about consumer versus the customer and intimacy and convenience, I think, are really important as we think about our businesses, and also about how it affects risk, because our risks start to change when we think about a business that way. So we also talk a lot in business, and this word of transformation is somewhat overused. I just want to talk through a particular example here. The picture on the left is, if you look closely, is an impossible waterfall because the water is going uphill. But this schematic on the right is actually the Uber business process. So when you think about Uber, we all know them, but when they enter a new city, they acquire service providers, which are the folks that drive the cars, and they acquire customers. And when we get into a new city and want to use the service, we open the app on our phone. They locate us as a customer. They propose a service, and they select a service provider, a particular driver. And the interesting thing is, when we say we're ready to go, the first thing they do is commit the service provider. Now, that's really the first unusual thing that happens here, because committing the supplier before you commit the customer, in a one-to-one transaction like this, is highly unusual. The next thing they do, which might only be a fraction of a second later, is they commit and charge a customer. That's us, and they charge us then and there. So the other next great thing here is they've got a day sales outstanding of 0. They get the cash on the day of the activity. And which is amazing. If you ever worked in a business with a DSO of 20 days, that's nirvana, but 0 is just unbelievable. But it doesn't stop there. The third really interesting thing is the service provider, the driver, gets paid within 7 days of the ride. And they might only get paid up to 75% of the fee, but they don't have to get the customer, they don't have to do any marketing. But what they do like is being paid so promptly. And they say if you work for another company, you might get paid 30 or 45 days later. So when you look at this process, 3 really interesting things pop up. One is it's really, it's great for the customer and consumer. You get what you want when you need it. It's really great for the supplier because they're delighted. And it's great for the company because they get an amazing cash flow and cash float in there. And then if you look at that process, it's not a classic revenue cycle or order to cash cycle. It's not a classic procurement cycle or procure to pay. It's an integrated business cycle. The other thing that's interesting is actually what's behind that isn't particularly sophisticated technology. What's the really interesting piece about it is where they've reassembled the sequence of what you might expect a normal best practice process to be. So that to me is transformation. It's changing the nature, changing the structure, assembling our processes in a different way and changing our business model. Now, I'm not suggesting every company should do this, but our companies are looking at how to rearrange their processes. But this very activity changes our exposure to risk and changes the nature of risks we are exposed to and how we might respond to them. So it's important to understand what we're doing in this as we look at risk. So we know a lot of important stuff's going on. We know our business environment is changing. We know our markets are changing. We know expectations from stakeholders and investors are changing. Expectations of employees are changing. And we've got some big catalysts. We've got technology and data, clearly. And we've got this consumer awakening, as we talked about with Netflix. the convenience and intimacy. So many business-to-business organizations are now realizing they better start being a business-to-consumer business, and this includes many consumer goods companies who typically distribute through intermediaries and distributors. Again, that completely changes your risk profile. And we're all being pushed for less cost, less cycle time, less of anything negative, and more value, speed, and all the good stuff. And there's growing scrutiny, not just in getting the results, but making sure that how we get the results is acceptable. We've seen reports on Apple's supply chain and other folks, and even Uber's supply chain. We've seen reports on that and how there's a view now of principal performance. It's not just enough to produce results. You've got to produce them in a way that your stakeholders are happy with. And so your supply chain partners matter, everybody matters. So things are changing across the piece. Now, when we look at managing risk, certainly in the English language, risk is perceived as a negative word, but it's really about achieving performance and value over the long term. And really managing risk is about managing both threat and opportunity. The two sides of the same coin. And really every decision we make, whether it's crossing the road or buying a car or in a business, whether it's a merger and acquisition discussion, whether launching a new product, these decisions are all based on balancing threat and opportunity. And I think it's important we think about risk management in that way, because it's all about balance. And this is the point we're trying to get to, because I think risk management in the era we're coming into, and enterprise risk management, is very much about balance rather than an old style rearward looking way of thinking. So if we look at the things that we need to manage from our enterprise risk management perspective, looking at opportunity, threat, and performance, historically we've been very focused on things within our organization, our processes. How do our processes work? How do our operations work? How's our organization, our people, our systems, our products? And that's all very well, but we've always been, we've always had these things on the upper side here as well. But now with such interconnected businesses, we're much more involved now with our consumers and our customers. We're much more involved, and it's much more, our reputation is much more key to us. We're more involved and more directly interacting with vendors and partners. So all of this is kind of broadening out the scope of how we see the things that matter to us in terms of risk. And obviously many are internal and many are external. And what is leading us to the recognition is that we used to think we could control everything inside our organization. Well, that was probably a bit of a dream, but at least you have some element of control inside the organization. But beyond the organization, you can only influence. And I think this is important in risk management. It's the decisions we take that affect what we control and what we can influence. And this is the way we need to be thinking about risk management. And of course, what needs to be managed, organizations are classifying at a high level, and I'm sure you guys use similar breakdowns. So we have strategic risk, and operational risk, and financial risk, compliance risk, and reputational risk, which is a major issue and a growing issue these days. But also the broad hazards of earthquake and fire and disaster, and cyber risk. Typically, historically, has always been kind of regarded as just an element, a characteristic of risk that fits in any other the topics. But it's becoming such a big deal now that many organizations are holding this as a high-level classification. So these are the kind of things that we need to think about, or the ways we need to think about risk, and they all interrelate. And we'll be hearing more about that from Gil shortly. And there's kind of a tug of war going on. So we know about this. If we're thinking about risk management, both from threat and opportunity, there's a tug of war between those two things. There's a tug of war between our conventional approach to managing risk, to do with policy, control, preventing things happening, rigor, and the need for agile decision-making in a new, faster world. So all of these things are really, are creating challenges about how do we respond and how do we deal with managing risk with these pressures. And one of the ways of helping us sort of deal with this cycle time and agility demand is thinking more about how risk management really fits into the cycle. This is the risk response cycle, or we like to call it the fact to act cycle. So, kind of 1 o'clock on this disc, the risk identification, assessment, understanding the risk itself, and then in many cases we might want to manage that risk through some form of policy or some way of defining how we're going to mitigate the risk. And again, we sometimes mitigate or implement those mitigations through controls, formal controls, and then we monitor those controls, policies, and the risk itself. And the key point is, at some point, we have to make decisions. We have to act. And I think integrating our thinking between understanding the risk, informing ourselves about changing nature of risk and changing nature, how our operations are affecting our risk, and how we need to make decisions on a daily basis is a really important thing. So that's why we call this a fact to act cycle. So talked a little bit about decision making. I mean, decision making is the essence of business, and it's the essence of what leadership and management and frontline folks are doing daily. And we really think about decisions quite often when they go wrong. And so when decisions go wrong, what are the key causes? Well, these are the classic causes of decisions that go wrong. Poor framing, assumptions that may not be right or incomplete, insufficient, inaccurate information, perhaps not going out to get all the relevant information, not considering all the options, and not considering unintended consequences. So if we can focus on making our decision making better and having a better hit rate of success, really that's kind of the essence of risk management, and we call that risk informed decision making. And I think a great way of thinking about that is when you look at you know, a sailor in a race, like in this case, you don't you know, they don't look at the sea one day and say, oh no, it's a bit too rough for me, I'm not sailing today. It's about whatever the conditions are, we've got to work the best way to get across those conditions to achieve our objectives in the best time possible, but also dealing with, you know, minimizing threats of, you know, risk to life and limb, for example. So I like this picture because it helps us think about, you know, risk management not as avoiding risk, but as working the best way to manage the situation we're in. So I like this quote at the bottom about the pessimists and the optimists, and the leaders adjusting the sails. And of course, when we're looking at these issues of managing risk in our businesses, we have, you know, we have processes across the organization and out to our customers and business partners and suppliers, but also we have, you know, leadership, you know, groups of leaders who own chunks of those processes. And the truth of the matter is, in most businesses, those executives don't necessarily have the tightest alignment between priorities and performance measures, for example. So, you know, I mean, all of us know the many examples in kind of most businesses, but certainly in banking, for example, where the desire to achieve a new customer acquisition target, performance measure, actually causes a challenge later on in terms of the quality of what's been achieved, and indeed the risks the organization's exposed to. So this idea about understanding how executives see their performance measures and how, from a risk management point of view, how do we try and align those things, even when there are natural differences between different leaders who run different ends of the process. Which leads us to this whole point about, how do I get a single source of truth? I need to be able to, if I want to have risk-informed decision-making and be fast and agile, I've got to be able to have a single source of truth. And you know, obviously that's technological in one level, but it's also philosophical. I need to be able to make sure we've got common understanding about what we mean by the nature of the conditions we're operating under, what we mean by the threats, what we mean by the opportunities, what we mean by the impact. We need to be able to share that insight. We need to be able to see risk response and all those risk responses happening around the world in different parts of our business, becoming an early warning system for other colleagues who are facing decisions right now which affect similar risk factors. So this idea of using a single source of ever-growing truth to inform decision-making in places that might be halfway around the world or in different business units. And I think that's a key element that we have within this thinking. And this is all part of the move from silos to enterprise risk management. We all have had, and many of us still have, silos of risk thinking and silos of risk management related to product, related to supply, related to finance and compliance and all the rest of it. But what we're realizing is a lot of interconnection between these things, and there's a lot of commonality. So the idea of being really effective in one line of risk management is becoming less important maybe than understanding the whole picture and how our risks of different types interrelate, which is one of the reasons we want a common approach to enterprise risk management, so that things that relate and touch different parts of the business can be addressed in a coherent way. So on this topic of silos and move to enterprise risk management. Got a question for you here. In your organization, again, this is anonymous, so don't worry, you're not spilling anything too intimate. In number one, is your organization currently a silo, series of silos of risk and policy management and compliance activities across the organization? Or is it two, you're considering an enterprise focus to risk management? Or three, you're on the road to enterprise risk management already? Or four, you're really into enterprise risk management, sustaining it and optimizing it? Or five, it's just not applicable to you right now? So have a think about that. So are you in the silo world? Are you considering in the move to a kind of more enterprise focus? Are you on the road to that, practically making that happen? Are you sustaining enterprise risk management? You're there and you're driving optimization focus on not applicable. If you give that 10 seconds and think about it, it's an important question to consider. So let's see how we're doing. Are we ready to look at some results? Let's see what we got. So, okay, so more than half of you have silos of risk, and that's kind of not a surprise, and we know that's kind of the default position. I think the interesting point here is, how do we get ourselves up these curves? So thank you for that. Now, one of the ways we get ourselves up those curves is, as well as understanding the business case, the why do we want to have an enterprise view, there's also this idea of having a common process, and a common process isn't just saying this is what we do and this is a sequence of things we do. It's a bit more complex than that. So we have this 9-themed pentagon, and each of these is really, really important. And they might seem like simple questions, like what are the outcomes you want from enterprise risk management or for any form of risk management? Might seem very obvious, but when you get into the discussion, it's not as obvious as it sounds. How do we identify and manage stakeholders? How do we measure and communicate progress? How do we organize and govern our approach to risk management? What is our process design, the kind of the activities we perform and the information we need? Where is our process placed, sourced, and operated? Of course, there's something like automation enabling technology. And do we have the skills and capability? And do we have the ability to view this as a service to the business and continually optimize it and deliver more support for an agile business? So those 9 themes, I think, are really important, and about how you think about ERM or any form of risk management as a process. So I've talked you through some introductory thoughts here, and I want to hand you over now to Gil Hebert, who's going to talk a little bit about balancing change around process, organization, and tool, because there's a lot of moving parts to this. And Gil, with all your experience in companies around the world, tell us some of your observations here.
All righty, thank you, Dan, and hopefully the accent change is not too jarring for everybody, because I am from the southeast of the United States. But I'm going to deal with the next few slides regarding technology as an enabler. And before we actually get to the technology part, we've got a couple slides. One is about getting the lay of the land at the engagement, and this is about understanding what's happening at the company which might affect the project. And these kind of things a lot of times are found out when you're having lunch or dinner with the project team. You'll discover about people's personal biases, personal agendas. I remember one engagement I was on, and there was this one fella, and he was very adversarial from the very beginning. And about, I don't know, second week, I had lunch with one of the project team members, and we got to talking, and I found out that this guy had worked with Price Waterhouse back when it was Price Waterhouse. And I said, oh, that's interesting, because I worked with Price Waterhouse a long time ago. So I scheduled lunch with this guy and let him know that I was with Price Waterhouse, and his demeanor completely changed. He was like, oh, you're a brother. And we were PW brothers, and he became changed from adversarial to almost a champion. So, these kind of things come out over lunch and dinner. I had another client where there was a merger that was planned, and it wasn't brought up during the project. And in fact, it never was discussed. And the merger came to fruition about 6 months into the project, and it turned out that the merging company had an ERM solution that was quite mature, and they had to make a decision right in the middle of the project if they were going to continue the project or go with the merging company's software solution for ERM. And they determined that they were going to go with the ERM solution from the merging company. The project was shut down, and we, essentially wasted, I believe it was about 4.5, 5 months doing that. So getting this lay of the land is very important. And one of the big important things during this lay of the land understanding is the change culture of the client. Are they change resistant, or do they embrace change? Change is hard, and it takes effort, and it takes energy. People understandably will say, what's in this for me? And they'll be, I don't have time for this. I have a day job. You can't ignore this, and you can't hope that it goes away. This needs to be addressed head on, essentially by showing the need for the change and the benefit of the change to the engagement team and to the users. Hopefully this will be able to convert some of the resistors or the resistance to change and maybe make some of them champions. So when we get into technology, we feel a very important part is the business risk model. That's the starting point for an ERM implementation. And this identifies fundamental things that are important, as well as establishing relationship between these items. It's the basis for understanding the needs of the stakeholders, will be the basis for any reports and dashboards. And of course, it's the basis for your design and configuration of the technology solution. So if it's not done correctly, it's going to cause major setbacks to the project. Now, part of what you'll identify in the business risk model is your risk taxonomy. And taxonomies are used to manage complexity, and ERM uses them to manage risk structure complexity. So your risk structure is likely to be a network of risks and not a strict hierarchy. And you should also keep in mind the differences between corporate and local risks. Both are important and can be represented in the risk network. So we've got an example of a risk network. And if you'll notice at the top, we've got risk categories, operational risk and strategic risk, and we have local risks at the bottom in green. And we've got restricted warehouse access, which is a risk mapped to a single parent under operational. We've got staff constraints, which is a standalone local risk. And then we've got the networking there with shipping delays, where it's mapped to multiple parents in multiple branches under operational and strategic risk. So moving on to process design, it's important to design with your end value in mind. The first and foremost, ERM process should enable risk-informed decision-making, which Dan already mentioned. That's the end state everyone wants to get to, and it should be a major driver of your process design. Another driver of process design is reports and dashboards. And here we want to think quality, not quantity. I had an engagement where they wanted 20 reports. They want us to build 20 reports, and we said, well, let's think about that. Maybe we can just build a handful of them. And they're like, no, we need 20 reports. So we spent weeks building these 20 reports, and about 6 months after we go live, we made some inquiries, and we found out that, which is what we expected, they were only using a handful of the reports, and the other 14 or 15 they didn't use at all. So again, with respect to reports and dashboards, it's always quality over quantity. And another thing we've been finding lately due to technology changes over the past couple of decades, people like keyword searches. That's what they expect, and that's how they want to search for items. And where possible, we need to implement and give users access to keyword searches. And we put something in here about data capture. It should be as simple as it can be, and if it's possible, we need to integrate it into the user's daily routine. We also put something in here about seeding data. We want to minimize the user data entry on day one when they go live, so we want to seed as much data as possible into the system. So we've got a couple slides here on a day in the life. So this is a day in the life of a risk oversight user view into the application. All of these charts and dashboards that we'll look at are drillable, so you can see details that make up the higher level information. That first slide, we've gone to the classic heat map, and we'll finish up with the detailed report showing issues open in the last 60 days with a rating of high. Then we've got a risk owner view into the application. We start off with a risk assessment form, and then an issue form for capturing action plans to mitigate highly rated risks. So Dan addressed much of this slide in the Pentagon slide, which promoted the concept that a successful implementation requires attention to more than just technology. So just to reinforce a few of those ideas, we need to set objectives and expectations and measure what's being done in order to communicate status appropriately to stakeholders. You need to have the right people with the right skills, and those people need to be available to participate when and as needed. And lastly, you need to prepare for continuous improvement, and this includes satisfaction of stakeholders and addressing changing business needs. If your process is changing, then you need to explain not only what the change is, but why you need to change and the benefits of the change to the users. So a long time ago, a senior consultant, when I was a junior consultant starting off with Pricewaterhouse, a senior consultant explained it to me this way. It's like dealing with your child and your spouse. With your child, you can just tell him what to do and that's it, he's going to do it. With your spouse, you need to tell them what you want them to do, how it might benefit them, and maybe you'll get the results that you want. Over the years, I found that works well in my engagements, and it turned out I wound up getting married, and that eventually helped me in my marriage as well using that technique. As far as the tool, we need to address what's done in the tool, how it will be done in the tool, tool roles and how they map back to process roles. And about solution support, so something that sometimes gets overlooked. Where and who's going to staff the help desk? What are the hours of the help desks? And finally, when it comes to tool issues, bugs, and enhancement requests, who's the contact at the technology side and who's the contact for the project? That all needs to be planned out, and that's a theme here is planning, planning, planning. So to facilitate training and acceptance, we've come up with what we call modular standard procedures, and they're very similar to a quick start guide that you might get with your Amazon Echo or your Google Home. These MSPs support a single function. They're usually about 10 pages as opposed to a tool user guide that may be hundreds of pages and covers a broad spectrum of processes and functions. And the MSPs don't just show how to use the tool, but they show how the tool supports the process that we've designed. They're not just documentation, we also create short videos. We found that about the 5-minute mark is a good a target for videos. After that, people start to lose focus. With regards to training, of course, we use the MSPs that we've created, as well as doing hands-on exercises. There's no substitute for getting a user's hands-on in the technology. We conduct face-to-face training when possible and do train the trainer sessions. And training sessions need to be kept to at max 15 users per proctor. So I was doing some training session, or I was doing a training session, and they had 25 users in the training session, and I was the only proctor, and I couldn't get them to lower the number of users. The problem became, for this particular session, I needed to do a bunch of one-on-one sessions with the users during the training. And because of that, we ran out of time and we're only able to cover 75% of the material. So at max 15 users per proctor is recommended. So I think we've got a couple of MSPs that we created for creating a risk and a policy creation. They all begin with how to access the forms in the application. And then we detail data entry components, importantly, how they fit into the business process, and then provide guidance on how to fill in the more complex data components. So this last slide is about independent expertise. So first of all, independent experts can be internal or external. Now, internal experts that are not stakeholders or directly involved in the project, they're able to view the project through a different prism, and this usually will positively affect the project. So anytime you can seek out internal experts is a good thing for an engagement. Now, external independent experts, they already possess deep knowledge of the technology. They've been through this change process elsewhere. They're there to help you avoid mistakes and pitfalls because they've already seen them, they've already made them. Essentially, external independent experts can help you accelerate the implementation process, and they'll get you where you want to go efficiently and successfully. So thanks for your attention, and with that, I'll turn it back over to Dan.
Thanks very much, Gil. There's some deep insight there you've got from your practical experience, so thank you for that. I would just remind everyone it's a good time to ask some questions. There's been a lot of specific best practices and ideas shared here. So you've got questions, pop them into the panel and we'll deal with them at the end. So I've got a question for you. So Gil talked about the whole process, including technology. And I'm just interested to see a sort of show of hands. What technology do you use today to support risk management, ERM, and given the group of, given the spectrum of job functionals here, let's say risk management and compliance, let's say, and the vagaries of GoToWebinar mean you can only have 5 options, and obviously there could be 10 or 12 or 15 here. So try to choose some popular ones. So just for if you use metric stream, click 1. The second one, if you use Open Pages from IBM, if you include Archer from RSA, now Dell, if you use BWise, now NASDAQ, or if you use some other of the many risk management, control and compliance tools, or none, if you would click 5. So it should be fairly straightforward. Just interested to see the spectrum there. Should be pretty quick, so I'll give you 10 seconds. If you don't know what you're using, just 5 is probably the answer for you. So let's have a look, see what we got. So we've got, we guessed, so half of you are using other or none, and of course we didn't have enough room for other and none as separate answers. So that's kind of interesting. About a quarter of you using metric stream. No one in this group using Open Pages. Quite a few using Archer, a few using BWise. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. So moving on. So Gil talked about a number of things in terms of understanding the landscape of the organization and the dynamics before you get into sort of upskilling and bringing up the capability of enterprise risk management. But there is a general issue around driving change and adoption, which comes up time and time again. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about it. Now, I already talked about this pentagon, this critical, these 9 themes. And as I say, when you look at this sort of dispassionately, they look fairly straightforward. Some look, well, they might be quite hard, but I would just tell you from experience, when you get into the discussion with stakeholders and participants around each of these ones, there's an important discussion to be had on every one. So I encourage you to have those discussions. Now, obviously, usually we're not starting from a clean sheet of paper. So normally starting from some form of risk management, and you try and move to a new process or an enhanced process. So the items on the left are really kind of the mechanism of how to go through the change process. So it's diagnosing the current operating model in risk management, again, through those 9 themes, designing what you want to happen, confirming that's achievable and doable, implementing it, documenting, educate, verify, sustain, along the lines that Gil referred to. But so kind of the right-hand piece, though, I cannot state highly enough how important that is to help get clarity over what you're trying to achieve and get stakeholders aligned against what's needed. And those left-hand items are really about how to make the change process. But this is also, risk management, enterprise risk management are not it's not a kind of a project of, you start and then you end and you're in risk-informed decision-making, everything's fine, you can forget about it. We're implementing processes, not projects. So in terms of process implementation, I really think it's important to think about the journey. So what's the aspiration of this journey towards enterprise risk management? What's this aspiration towards risk-informed decision-making? And what are the outcomes that looks like down the road? And then map out what are the starting steps that we're making and what are the steps along the way, along this roadmap. So you can build a business case and plan that everyone signs up to, and they understand what they're getting today and what they're working towards. And this is true in any major change initiative. but it's certainly important to make sure that you don't have people confused about what's happening today and where compared to where we're trying to get to. So I'd say that roadmap is a pretty critical thing. Now, we always talk about change, and there's nothing worse than change, and people hate change. And we all know this. This comes up in all change management training courses. But what's interesting about this whole thing about the kind of fear of change is actually, it turns out, and when you think about your own behavior, it's not so much we're afraid of change. We're kind of afraid of loss, and the loss might not actually happen. It might be perceived loss. We might worry about losing things, and that loss might be physical things. It might be money, but it might be power. It might be the independence. It might be the ability to have a large span of control in an organization. It might be the idea that, I'm running a P&L business and I don't want to lose that. And I think this is a really important thing for us to think about in change management right from the beginning, because a lot of the fears about new processes, particularly in risk management, a lot of the fears are actually imagined, so we can deal with that early. But there are some fears which might actually be genuine. So it may be, this idea of having enterprise risk management where we've got interconnections between, we recognize the interconnection between risk. It might mean that some leaders aren't allowed to be or can't be as independent and isolated as they might used to be. There's more collaboration required, and maybe people see that as a loss, and we've got to deal with it head on and early on in our discussions with stakeholders and executives. But one of the ways of dealing with it, so you can deal with it up front, but dealing with it down in the practicalities of of implementing the process and technology, is think about how do we motivate participation and adoption. You've got kind of the leadership challenge we talked about before, but also if we can design a process and a supporting technology that allows us to motivate through enlightened self-interest, we're really onto a winner. And some of the examples of this are, if you make it easier for people to find what they need to do their job, then all of a sudden participating in the process has some personal benefit. If it makes it easier for me to connect to other people I care about associated with some of the risks I'm managing and some of the process activities I'm connected to, people around the world who I'd otherwise not be so connected to, that makes life easier. So ensuring that teamwork benefits me as well as others is a really important thing. So the idea of reinforcing the perspiration of the daily work we all have to do with some aspiration that actually, I'm participating in this, but I get benefit as well. So I think that's an important way of thinking, important psychology for us to adopt. And if we think about that pentagon, those 9 themes we talked about before, we talked about they're all driven from outcomes, right? And this fish diagram, at the head of the fish is the outcomes, the most important thing in the pentagon. And then we look at how do we drive the value to the business and how do we drive adoption? And we drive that through looking at those elements of the pentagon themes to a point we can sustain that with continuous improvement. And of course, the fish rots from the head, so if we don't get outcomes right, none of this matters. So that's worth thinking about. On the topic of change, I just want to ask you one more question. Your change management adoption experience. So as you make change in your organization around risk management, or maybe around anything, are you in an organization where every group operates their own expectations? Are you in an organization where you strive for common process but struggle with adoption? Do you have a common technology but the process isn't working for you? Or do you have a common process but the technology adoption is a challenge? Or 5, you're well on the road to a common consistent approach and things are looking pretty good. So just think about that. Every group operates their own expectations. That's kind of related to the silo discussion. We strive for a common process but struggle with adoption. And 3, specifically, common technology but we've got process issues. 4, common process but technology issues. And 5, everything is hunky-dory. Let's have you can do it. You can make a suggestion on that, what you think, where you're at. It's anonymous. Nobody's going to see what you say. So we're not going to move on until you enter your 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. It's not painful. You can do it. Let's have a look. Let's see what we're doing here. So I think, okay, that's a very honest assessment. So we know from the earlier poll that we know this silo issue is significant here, but striving for a common process and struggling with adoption is a common challenge. And hopefully some of the ideas we've given you will help you think about that. I'd certainly encourage you to think about the pentagon. So as you look to kind of getting to this more enterprise-wide approach to risk management, as you look about creating value, we've got to focus on business processes themselves, because risk is inherent within them. We're not looking just at risk management processes. We've got to make sure we agree and confirm desired outcomes and those things that associate with it. We've got to look at real working practices and behaviors. We've got to design a mechanism that works. We've got to configure technology that supports the process. We've got to drive alignment between stakeholders for adoption. We talked some of those. That's a part of that to do change management. We've got to make sure we've got business as usual that works and a governance process that works well. And ultimately, this is about giving us that capability. And using that Pentagon, there's 3 ways you can really take that Pentagon and use it yourself. As I say, there's 9 key themes and key questions. You either have in your current situation, where you may be in a static situation, you've got some challenges, you can use that Pentagon and go through those 9 questions to use it to health check your current situation, identify where you can get some quick wins on improving the process, and help you define a roadmap. If you're currently implementing ERM or any other discipline of risk management, and you're in the middle of it, it's an opportunity to validate your process, opportunity to validate how you're taking to the technology, an opportunity to validate how you're driving the adoption and change management process. And if you're just starting out, again, you can use those 9 phases to get you on the road to risk-informed decision making. Ultimately, this is all about moving risk management from being a rearward-looking, kind of box-ticking, compliance-oriented focus through to looking forwards to enabling decision making in a much more agile business. So these are the topics we talked about. I want you to ask some more questions. We've got a bunch of questions we're going to answer. Just before we go to those, we have one additional thing for you. We have offered out a free of charge situation assessment for those of you who might want to participate in it, wherever you are in the process. It's purely 60 minutes, doesn't cost you anything, there's no obligations. But if you want to go through those 9 phases of the Pentagon based on your current situation and try and get some advice, recommendations and thoughts on your current strategy, current situation, we'll do that with you at no charge. So just in terms of, we're not going to share these, but just in terms of letting us know, if you'd like to do that, just click 1. If you say, no, I don't want to do that, there's 2. And if 3, if I'm not sure, I'll get back to you. If you wouldn't mind doing that, it's very simple. As I say, we're offering that today because it's Halloween. So you get a 60-minute session, or up to 60 minutes, talk through your current situation. We can take you through that framework, which you can use afterwards to use at your own speed and in your own time. So I'm hoping that you're clicking 1, 2, or 3. If you don't know whether to click 1 or 2, then it's obviously 3. And if you don't, and you know it's a 1 or 3, then it's definitely 2. And I think you can work out the other alternative. So okay, thank you for that. Right. So thank you. We've got some questions from you, so keep asking them. And actually, from now on, if you've got more questions, probably best to email Gil or myself. We've got a couple of questions. We've got a couple of minutes to come through these, so we'll come back at you. So what we got here? We've got a few questions here. So what we got? Right. First question. We have silos of risk management across the business. What is the best way to engage all these groups in the ERM, the enterprise risk management discussion? Okay, that's an interesting question. That's, I mean, as we saw, that's at least 50% of the audience, right, today. So my take on that is it's all about getting the stakeholders to understand their linkages between their risk worlds. As I say, we've got product-related risk, we've got vendor-related risk, we've got compliance-related risk, but there's a lot of elements in these that overlap and intertwine. So my suggestion is look for examples of risks that relate across those silos and build that into your stakeholder discussions as you socialize, the case for an enterprise view. And the more examples of that you can find, whether it's relationships, and there are many of them, and maybe you can do this as part of that 60-minute web session if you want. But you want to remember, I think you want to remember that perspective of the perceived loss we talked about. As you do it, autonomy can be desirable. So some of the reasons that people want to keep in a silo is autonomy has some benefits. But collaboration has some benefits too, and that's the goal we have to explain. So hopefully that helps. But again, if you have got a specific issue there, it might be worth going through the Pentagon with you. Another question: our current technology is not stable, especially our custom developments, and our users are complaining about complexity. Wow. Okay. What's your advice? I think I'll give this to you, Gil.
Yeah, I'll take that one. So I think I heard customization in that question, and of course that's a dirty word. You know, we need to focus on configuration to meet process outcomes. If a configurable technology solution won't meet the process, then maybe you have to tweak the process a little bit. But as a last resort, customization is the last resort. You should avoid it at all costs. And then I think I heard something about complaining about complexity. That's a tough one to answer without knowing more of the situation. The only thing off the top of my head is when the process was designed, was there a good understanding of the working business practices? If there wasn't, then maybe some unneeded complexities were introduced. But without knowing more, I wouldn't be able to answer anything more than that.
Yeah, it does sound like a complexity issue, and certainly simplicity, as Gil said in his talk, simplicity is the key. I'm aware that we're slightly over time, so I do appreciate you hanging on for us. And we have a few other questions which we'll respond to by email, so thank you for those. Thank you very much indeed for your attention. I hope you found it useful, and wherever you are in the world today, and I know there's folks from 3 continents on, have a good rest of your day. So thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Gil.